I was adjusting my navy blue dress in the bathroom mirror of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach, when I heard the wedding coordinator's sharp voice echoing through the marble-tiled space. "Table assignments are final, no exceptions," she was saying to someone on her phone. "I don't care if Great Aunt Millicent thinks she deserves a better seat than the catering staff." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The words hit me like a physical blow, though I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Surely she wasn't talking about me. Surely my own sister wouldn't have seated me at the staff table at her wedding. But as I walked back into the reception hall, clutching my small purse and fighting the urge to flee, I caught sight of the seating chart displayed on an ornate golden easel near the entrance. My eyes scanned the elegant calligraphy, searching for my name among the carefully arranged guest list. Table 1 hosted the immediate family. Table 2 welcomed the bride's college friends. Table 3 seated business associates. I kept scanning, my heart sinking with each passing second, until I found it. There, at the very bottom of the chart, almost hidden behind a spray of white orchids, was Table 15. The catch-all table where they'd placed the photographer's assistant, the florist's helper, 2 servers who were friends of the family, and me, Cassandra Whitmore, sister of the bride. I should have seen this coming, really. The signs had been there for months, subtle but unmistakable, like hairline cracks in what I'd thought was solid ground. When Evelyn had announced her engagement to Marcus Rothschild, heir to the Rothschild pharmaceutical empire, our family dynamic had shifted in ways I was only beginning to understand. Suddenly, every conversation revolved around wedding venues that cost more than most people's houses, guest lists that read like a Fortune 500 directory, and social expectations that seemed designed to remind me exactly where I stood in this new hierarchy. My name is Cassandra Whitmore, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew my place in the world. I'm 31 years old, a high school English teacher at Roosevelt Academy in downtown Portland, and I've spent the better part of my adult life believing that family meant unconditional love and acceptance. I live in a modest apartment in the Hawthorne district, drive a 7-year-old Honda Civic that I bought used, and my idea of splurging is ordering guacamole with my burrito bowl at lunch. Evelyn is my younger sister by 3 years, though you'd never know it from the way she's always carried herself. Even as children, she possessed a natural magnetism that drew people to her like moths to flame. Where I was bookish and introspective, content to spend afternoons reading in our childhood bedroom, Evelyn was social and ambitious, always scheming about how to climb whatever ladder happened to be in front of her. She'd graduated from Stanford with an MBA and had been working in investment banking when she met Marcus at a charity gala in San Francisco. The transformation had been swift and complete. Within months of their first date, Evelyn had quit her job, moved into Marcus's penthouse apartment, and begun what she called her new career as a philanthropist and social hostess. What this meant, in practical terms, was that she spent her days planning elaborate dinner parties, attending board meetings for charities she'd never heard of 6 months earlier, and cultivating relationships with other wealthy wives who could advance her husband's business interests. I tried to be happy for her. I really did. When she called to tell me about the engagement, I'd squealed with excitement and immediately started planning how I could help with the wedding preparations. When she described the ring, a 5-carat diamond that cost more than I made in 2 years, I'd gushed appropriately about how gorgeous it must be. When she talked about the wedding venue, a historic mansion on the Columbia River with its own vineyard and helicopter landing pad, I'd listened with what I hoped sounded like enthusiasm rather than bewilderment. But somewhere in the months between the engagement announcement and today, I'd begun to feel like I was watching my sister disappear into a world where I didn't speak the language. Our phone conversations became shorter and more stilted, punctuated by awkward silences and cultural references I didn't understand. She'd mention people by their first names, assuming I knew who Lillian was or what the Henderson situation referred to, then seemed surprised when I had to ask for context. The wedding planning process had been particularly illuminating. When Evelyn asked me to be her maid of honor, I'd been thrilled and honored, imagining cozy afternoons spent taste-testing cakes and looking at flower arrangements. What I hadn't anticipated was that being maid of honor in a society wedding meant navigating a complex web of social protocols that seemed designed to highlight exactly how out of place I was. The dress selection alone had been an education in class consciousness. Evelyn had scheduled our appointment at an exclusive bridal boutique in the Pearl District, the kind of place where they served champagne in crystal flutes and had personal shoppers who addressed you by your last name. The bridesmaid dresses started at $800, which was more than I typically spent on clothing in an entire year. When I'd quietly mentioned the price to Evelyn, suggesting we might look elsewhere, she'd waved off my concerns with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never had to check her bank balance before buying lunch. "Don't worry about it, Cass," she'd said, using the childhood nickname that sounded increasingly foreign in her mouth. "Marcus and I will cover it. It's important that everyone looks cohesive for the photos." The offer had been generous, but it had also made me feel like a charity case, dependent on my sister's new wealth for the privilege of participating in her wedding. I'd accepted because refusing would have caused a scene, but the experience had left me feeling diminished in ways I was still trying to understand. Then there had been the bridal shower, hosted by Marcus's mother, Patricia Rothschild, at their estate in the West Hills. I'd arrived in my best dress, a black cocktail number I'd bought for a friend's wedding 2 years earlier, only to discover that I was underdressed by about 3 tax brackets. The other guests wore designer outfits that cost more than my monthly rent, carried handbags I recognized from magazine advertisements, and discussed vacation destinations like they were debating which coffee shop to visit. I'd spent the afternoon smiling politely, while women with names like Bunny and Muffy discussed their children's admissions to private schools I'd never heard of, their husbands' golf handicaps at country clubs with waiting lists, and charity events that seemed to require more planning than most people's weddings. When the conversation turned to everyone's summer plans, I'd mentioned that I was looking forward to reading some books I'd been meaning to get to, maybe taking a few day trips to the coast. The silence that followed had been deafening, broken only when Patricia had kindly asked if I had any exciting travel planned. "I don't really travel much," I'd admitted, immediately regretting the honesty. Teaching doesn't leave much time for vacations, and Portland has so much to offer locally. The women had nodded with the kind of polite interest people show when someone mentions a hobby they find incomprehensible, like collecting vintage lunchboxes or competitive yo-yoing. The conversation had quickly moved on to someone's upcoming trip to Tuscany, and I'd spent the rest of the afternoon feeling like an anthropologist observing a culture I'd never be invited to join. But nothing had prepared me for the bachelor and bachelorette party situation. Evelyn had decided to combine the traditional separate celebrations into one weekend trip to Napa Valley, staying at a luxury resort where the cheapest room.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Cost $400 a night. When she'd announced the plan during a family dinner, presenting it as a fait accompli rather than a proposal, I'd felt my stomach drop. The math was simple and unforgiving. 3 nights at the resort, plus meals at high-end restaurants, wine tastings at exclusive vineyards, and spa treatments that cost more than my monthly grocery budget would total somewhere around $2,000. It was money I simply didn't have, not without dipping into the emergency fund I'd been carefully building for the past 5 years. I'd tried to explain my situation to Evelyn privately, hoping we could find a solution that wouldn't embarrass either of us. But her response had revealed just how far apart our worlds had become. "Cass, it's my bachelorette party," she'd said, her voice carrying a note of impatience I'd never heard before. "This is important to me. Can't you just put it on a credit card? Everyone else is making it work." Everyone else, I'd wanted to point out, wasn't living on a teacher's salary. Everyone else didn't have student loans and a car payment and rent that consumed 60% of their income. Everyone else didn't have to choose between buying new clothes and contributing to their retirement fund. But saying any of that would have sounded like making excuses, so I'd simply nodded and promised to figure something out. In the end, I borrowed money from my parents, a humiliating conversation that had involved explaining why I couldn't afford to celebrate my sister's upcoming marriage. My mother had been understanding but worried, my father practical but disappointed. They'd given me the money without question, but I could see in their eyes the same concern I felt about how different Evelyn had become. The Napa weekend had been a masterclass in feeling out of place. While the other women discussed their favorite vintages and debated the merits of different winemaking techniques, I'd smiled and nodded and tried not to wince at the prices on the menus. While they'd talked about their recent purchases from designers I recognized only from red carpet coverage, I'd contributed stories about finding great deals at consignment shops and vintage stores. While they'd compared notes on their various properties and investment portfolios, I'd mostly listened and marveled at lives that seemed to exist in an entirely different economic universe. The weekend had culminated in a dinner at a restaurant where the tasting menu cost $300 per person, not including wine pairings. I'd watched in fascination and horror as the other women had ordered without looking at prices, discussed the sommelier's recommendations like they were debating which brand of breakfast cereal to buy, and casually added extra courses and premium wines to their orders. When the bill had arrived, they'd split it evenly without discussion, each contributing their share with the casual ease of people for whom money was never a limiting factor. I'd paid my portion with a credit card, knowing I'd be paying interest on that meal for months to come, and had smiled through my growing realization that this was my new reality. If I wanted to remain part of Evelyn's life, I'd need to find a way to keep up with expenses that were beyond my means, or accept being constantly reminded of my financial limitations. The wedding planning had continued with a series of similar experiences. The engagement party at the country club where I'd felt underdressed despite wearing my best outfit. The dress fittings where the seamstress had made subtle adjustments to accommodate my off-the-rack body in a gown designed for someone with a personal trainer and nutritionist. The rehearsal dinner at a restaurant where the menu was entirely in French and the cheapest entree cost $60. Through it all, I'd told myself that this was temporary. That once the wedding was over, things would go back to normal. That despite the obvious changes in Evelyn's lifestyle and priorities, she was still my sister, still the person who'd shared a bedroom with me for 18 years, still someone who valued our relationship above social considerations. The seating chart shattered that illusion completely. Standing in the reception hall, staring at my name grouped with the service staff, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't an oversight or a mistake. This was a deliberate statement about where I belonged in Evelyn's new world. I was family, technically, but I was also an embarrassment. Someone to be managed and minimized rather than celebrated and included. The other guests were beginning to find their tables, and I realized I had a choice to make. I could quietly take my assigned seat, endure the evening with whatever dignity I could muster, and pretend this was all perfectly normal. Or I could confront what had just happened and demand an explanation. I chose confrontation. I found Evelyn near the head table, radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, accepting congratulations from a group of women who looked like they'd stepped out of a society magazine. Her face was glowing with happiness and champagne, her smile bright and genuine as she laughed at something one of her new friends had said. For a moment, seeing her like that, I almost lost my nerve. She looked so beautiful, so happy, so perfectly in her element. But then I remembered the seating chart, and my resolve hardened. "Evelyn," I said, approaching the group with what I hoped looked like confidence rather than barely controlled anger. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" She turned toward me with the same radiant smile she'd been sharing with her other guests, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she sensed trouble. "Of course, Cass," she said, excusing herself from the group with practiced grace. "What's wrong? You look upset." "I am upset," I said, keeping my voice low but letting her hear the steel in it. "I just saw the seating chart." Her smile faltered for just a moment, before reassembling itself into something more cautious. "Oh, that," she said, her tone suggesting this was a minor detail hardly worth discussing. The wedding planner handled most of the seating arrangements. There were so many people to accommodate, and some of the tables filled up faster than others. "Evelyn," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, "you seated me with the catering staff." The words hung in the air between us, and I watched as my sister's face went through a series of micro-expressions. Surprise, defensiveness, and finally something that looked like guilt. "Cass, you're being dramatic," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's just a table assignment. The important thing is that you're here, that you're part of my special day." "Part of your special day?" I repeated, incredulous. You put me at table 15 with people who are being paid to be here. Your own sister. Your maid of honor. Evelyn glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with having this conversation in public. Can we discuss this later? She asked. After the reception? I don't want to make a scene. You don't want to make a scene? I said, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to control it. You've already made the scene, Evelyn. You made it when you decided I wasn't important enough to sit with your actual guests. That's not what this is about, she said, her own voice taking on a defensive edge. The seating chart was complicated. There were family dynamics to consider, business relationships to maintain. Marcus's family has certain expectations about these events. Certain expectations, I repeated slowly. And apparently those expectations don't include treating your sister like family. You are family, Evelyn said, but her words sounded hollow even to her. You'll always be my sister, Cass. But this wedding isn't just about us. It's about Marcus's position in the community, about the relationships we're building, about the image we need to project. The image you need to project, I said, the full reality of the situation finally crystallizing in my mind. And apparently I don't fit that image. Evelyn's silence was answer enough. I stood there for a long moment, looking at this woman who shared my DNA but seemed to have become a stranger. She was still beautiful, still charming, still capable of lighting up a room with her smile. But she was also someone who could look her own sister in the eye and explain why social considerations mattered more than family loyalty. Fine, I said finally. I understand perfectly now. Cass, don't be like this, Evelyn said, reaching out to touch my arm. You're overreacting. It's just a seating arrangement. No, I said, stepping back from her touch. It's not just a seating arrangement. It's a statement about who matters and who doesn't. It's a declaration about what kind of person you've decided to become. I turned to walk away, but Evelyn caught my wrist. Please, she said, and for a moment she sounded like the sister I remembered. Don't let this ruin my wedding day. I looked down at her hand on my wrist, then back up at her face. She was worried, I realized, but not about hurting me or damaging our relationship. She was worried about disruption, about drama, about anything that might interfere with the perfect evening she'd spent months orchestrating. I wouldn't dream of ruining your wedding day, I said, gently removing her hand from my wrist. I'll sit exactly where you've decided I belong. I walked back toward table 15, my head held high but my heart breaking with every step. The other guests were settling into their seats, and I could hear the gentle buzz of conversation, the clink of champagne glasses, the string quartet playing softly in the background. It was everything Evelyn had dreamed of, everything she'd worked so hard to create. And I was going to sit at the staff table and smile through every minute of it. The people at table 15 turned out to be exactly what I'd expected. Sarah, the photographer's assistant, was a cheerful art student from Portland State, who was working the wedding to pay for her camera equipment. Miguel and Rosa were servers from the catering company who'd been invited to sit and eat after helping with the cocktail hour. Janet was the florist's helper, an older woman who'd been arranging flowers for society events for 30 years and had stories that could curl your hair. And then there was me, the sister of the bride, trying to pretend that this was all perfectly normal. The conversation at our table was actually more interesting than what I'd overheard at the other tables. Sarah was passionate about photography and had fascinating insights about capturing authentic moments at events like this. Miguel was studying business at Portland Community College and had thoughtful opinions about the service industry and worker rights. Rosa was saving money to bring her parents to the United States from El Salvador and spoke movingly about family sacrifice and dreams. Janet had been in the wedding business long enough to have seen every kind of family drama imaginable, and she shared sanitized versions of stories that made me feel less alone in my current situation. It might have been the best conversation I'd had all evening, if I hadn't been so acutely aware of why I was having it. The dinner service began, and I watched as servers moved efficiently through the room, delivering plates of food that probably cost more per person than I spent on groceries in a week. The head table, where Evelyn sat radiant beside her new husband, received their meals first, followed by the family tables, then the business associates, then the college friends. Our table was served last, almost as an afterthought. I was picking at my salmon when I heard commotion from the direction of the head table. Marcus had stood up and was speaking to someone, his voice carrying a note of confusion and displeasure. I couldn't hear the words, but his body language suggested he was upset about something. The wedding coordinator appeared beside him, gesturing towards something and speaking rapidly. Marcus's expression grew more troubled, and he began scanning the room with his eyes, clearly looking for someone or something. His gaze landed on our table, and I saw the moment when he spotted me. His expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like anger, and he immediately began walking in our direction. "Oh dear," Janet murmured beside me. "The groom looks upset about something." Marcus reached our table within moments, his face flushed, and his jaw tight with what I was beginning to recognize as barely controlled fury. "Cassandra," he said, his voice carefully modulated but clearly strained. "I've just been informed about a mistake in the seating arrangements. I had no idea you'd been placed here." I looked up at him, this man I'd met perhaps a dozen times over the past year, who was now my brother-in-law, and apparently the only person at this wedding who thought there was something wrong with where I'd been seated. "It's fine, Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Really, the company here is lovely." "It's not fine," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You're Evelyn's sister. Your family. This is completely unacceptable." The conversation at nearby tables had begun to quiet as people noticed the commotion. I could feel eyes turning toward us, and I realized that the scene I'd been trying to avoid was happening anyway, just not in the way I'd expected. "Marcus, please," I said, standing up from my chair. "Don't make a fuss, it's your wedding day." "Exactly," he said, his anger now clearly visible. "It's my wedding day, and my wife's sister has been seated with the catering staff like she's not important enough to sit with the family. Someone is going to explain to me how this happened." The entire reception had begun to take notice now. Conversations were stopping, heads were turning, and I could see Evelyn at the head table, her face pale with what looked like panic. Marcus strode back toward the head table, and I realized with growing horror that he was going to confront Evelyn publicly about the seating arrangement. I followed him, hoping to minimize whatever was about to happen but knowing it was probably too late to prevent a scene. "Evelyn," Marcus said as he reached the head table, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet reception hall. "I need you to explain to me why your sister is sitting at table 15 with the service staff." The silence that followed was deafening. Every guest in the room was now watching this confrontation between the bride and groom, and I could see Evelyn's face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Surprise, fear, anger, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. "Marcus," she said, her voice artificially bright, "can we discuss this privately?" "No," he said, his voice firm. "We cannot. I want to know, right now, in front of everyone, why you thought it was appropriate to humiliate your own sister at our wedding." "I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone," Evelyn said, but her voice was shaking now. "The seating arrangements were complicated, and there were considerations." "What considerations," Marcus interrupted, "could possibly justify treating family like hired help?" The question hung in the air, and I realized that this moment was going to define not just the rest of the evening, but possibly the rest of all our relationships. Marcus was demanding an answer that would require Evelyn to either admit her priorities or lie in front of 200 witnesses. She chose to lie. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice gaining strength as she committed to the deception. "The wedding planner must have made an error. Of course Cassandra should be sitting with family. Let's fix this right now." But Marcus wasn't satisfied with the explanation, and I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe her. "A mistake," he repeated slowly. "Your own sister's name was mistakenly placed with the catering staff?" "Yes," Evelyn said, doubling down on the lie. "These things happen with large events. The important thing is that we correct it immediately." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then turned to the wedding coordinator, who had appeared beside the head table like a nervous rabbit. "Did you make this seating arrangement?" he asked her directly. The coordinator looked trapped, glancing between Marcus and Evelyn with obvious panic. "All seating arrangements were approved by the bride," she said carefully. "I followed the instructions I was given." The implication was clear, and Marcus's face darkened further. "So this wasn't a mistake," he said, turning back to Evelyn. This was intentional. "Marcus, please," Evelyn said, her composure beginning to crack. "Can we not do this here? In front of everyone?" "You're the one who chose to do this here," he said, his voice rising. "You're the one who decided to publicly humiliate your sister at our wedding. I'm just making sure everyone understands what actually happened." The reception hall was now completely silent except for the sound of Marcus's voice and the soft clink of someone nervously adjusting their champagne glass. I stood there, caught between wanting to disappear and wanting to hear whatever else he might say. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, turning to address the entire room. "I want to apologize to you all for this disruption, but I need to make something clear. My wife apparently decided that her sister, Cassandra, wasn't important enough to sit with the family at our wedding. Instead, she seated her with the service staff, presumably because she was embarrassed by something about her own sister." The gasps and murmurs that followed this announcement were audible throughout the room. I could see people turning to look at me, then at Evelyn, then back at Marcus, with expressions of shock and fascination. "This is not the kind of person I thought I was marrying," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I thought I was marrying someone who valued family, who understood loyalty, who would treat the people she claimed to love with respect and dignity." "Marcus, stop," Evelyn said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Please." "I'm not going to stop," he said. "Because what you did tonight tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. And it tells everyone else here something important about the kind of family they're witnessing being created." He turned back to me, his expression softening. "Cassandra, I am deeply sorry for how you've been treated tonight. You are family, you are important, and you deserved better than this." Then he did something that shocked everyone in the room, including me. He began removing his wedding ring. The collective gasp from the guests was audible, and Evelyn's face went white. "Marcus, what are you doing?" she whispered. "I'm making a decision about what kind of marriage I want to have," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I don't want to be married to someone who treats family like an embarrassment to be hidden. I don't want to build a life with someone whose values are so different from mine that she could do this to her own sister." He placed the ring on the head table and looked out at the assembled guests. "This wedding is over," he announced. "I'm sorry for the disruption to your evening, but I cannot in good conscience continue with this ceremony after what I've witnessed tonight." The chaos that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Guests began talking all at once, some standing up from their tables, others pulling out their phones to capture the drama. Evelyn began sobbing, reaching for Marcus, who stepped away from her touch. The wedding coordinator stood frozen, clearly having no protocol for this situation. And I stood in the middle of it all, the catalyst for the destruction of my sister's wedding, watching everything she'd worked for disintegrate in real time. Marcus walked over to me, ignoring the chaos surrounding us. "Cassandra," he said quietly, "I'm sorry you had to witness this. But I'm glad I found out who she really is before it was too late to do something about it." "Marcus," I said, finding my voice for the first time since this had all started, "you don't have to do this, it's your wedding day." "No," he said, his voice firm. "It was supposed to be our wedding day. But it turns out I don't know the person I was trying to marry." He looked back at Evelyn, who was now surrounded by her bridesmaids and her mother, all trying to comfort her while she sobbed. "A person who could treat family the way she treated you tonight is not someone I can trust to be my partner in life," he said. "I'm sorry it took this long for me to see it, but I'm grateful I saw it now instead of 5 years from now." He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of shocked guests, a devastated bride, and the most expensive party that ever ended before dessert was served. I stood there for a moment, taking in the wreckage of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my sister's life. Part of me felt vindicated, justified in the anger I'd been carrying all evening. But a larger part of me felt devastated by what had just happened. This wasn't what I'd wanted. I'd wanted acknowledgement, recognition, maybe an apology. I hadn't wanted to destroy my sister's marriage before it had even begun. But as I looked around the room at the chaos and drama, at my sister sobbing in her $1,000 dress, at the guests who were already gossiping about what they'd just witnessed, I realized something important. I hadn't destroyed anything. The destruction had been built into this evening from the moment Evelyn had decided that social status mattered more than family loyalty. The breakdown had been inevitable from the moment she'd chosen to value appearances over authenticity. The catastrophe had been waiting to happen since she'd decided that some people were worth more than others. Marcus had just been the one brave enough to say it out loud. I picked up my purse and walked toward the exit, passing tables full of guests who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with curiosity, a few with what might have been respect. But mostly they looked at me like someone who had somehow become the center of a story that would be retold at dinner parties for years to come. As I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Janet, the florist's helper from table 15, approaching with a concerned expression. "Honey," she said, touching my arm gently, "are you all right?" I considered the question seriously. Was I all right? My sister's marriage had just ended before it began. My family would probably never be the same. I'd become the subject of gossip that would follow me for months or years. I'd witnessed the public destruction of relationships that had taken years to build. But I was also no longer sitting at the staff table, pretending that being treated as less than family was acceptable. I was no longer making excuses for someone who'd chosen social climbing over sisterly love. I was no longer trying to fit into a world that had made it clear I wasn't welcome. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. "I think I'm going to be fine." And for the first time all evening, I actually believed it. I spent the next 3 days in my apartment, ignoring the endless stream of phone calls, text messages, and emails that followed me home from the wedding disaster. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications from numbers I recognized and many I didn't, but I couldn't bring myself to look at any of them. The world outside felt too complicated, too full of explanations I wasn't ready to give, and conversations I wasn't prepared to have. On Tuesday morning, I finally forced myself to return to work at Roosevelt Academy. Walking through the familiar hallways with their faded motivational posters and the persistent smell of cafeteria pizza felt like stepping back into a life that made sense. My students were focused on their upcoming finals, concerned with college applications and summer job prospects, blissfully unaware that their English teacher had become the unlikely protagonist in Portland's most talked-about social scandal. I was settling into my first period classroom, arranging papers and trying to pretend everything was normal, when my principal, Dr. Martinez, appeared in my doorway. She was holding a cup of coffee and wearing the expression she typically reserved for parent conferences about failing grades. "Cassandra?" she said, stepping into the classroom and closing the door behind her. "Do you have a moment to talk?" My stomach dropped. In the chaos of the weekend, it hadn't occurred to me that news of the wedding incident might reach my workplace. Roosevelt Academy served a diverse student population, but it also attracted families who moved in Portland's social circles. The kind of families who would have been at Evelyn's wedding, or who would hear about it through their networks. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the student desk beside my own. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Martinez sat down, her expression shifting from professional concern to something that looked more like curiosity. "I've been getting some interesting phone calls since yesterday," she said. "Apparently, you've become quite the topic of conversation among certain families in our community." I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I could only imagine what versions of Saturday night's events were circulating through Portland's gossip networks. "Dr. Martinez," I began, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish," she said. "The calls I've been receiving aren't complaints. They're inquiries. Parents wanting to know more about you, about your teaching philosophy, about your background and qualifications." I blinked, confused. That wasn't what I'd expected to hear at all. "I don't understand," I said. "Apparently," she continued, "your behavior at this wedding has impressed some people. The way you handled yourself, the dignity you showed under difficult circumstances. Several families have specifically requested that their children be placed in your classes next year." The irony was overwhelming. The same incident that had made me feel humiliated and exposed had somehow enhanced my professional reputation among people I'd never met. Mrs. Peterson called specifically to tell me about how you conducted yourself when you were, in her words, treated abominably by your own family, Dr. Martinez continued. She said it demonstrated exactly the kind of character and integrity she wants her daughter to learn from. Mrs. Peterson had been at the wedding. I remembered seeing her at one of the family tables, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled silver hair and a navy blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. I'd never spoken to her directly, but she'd apparently been watching everything that happened. There's something else, Dr. Martinez said, her tone becoming more serious. I received a call this morning from Marcus Rothschild. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard from Marcus since he'd walked out of the reception hall, and I'd been wondering how he was processing everything that had happened. He wants to meet with you, she continued. He said he has a proposition he'd like to discuss, something related to educational initiatives his family foundation is developing. I stared at her, trying to process this information. Marcus wanted to meet with me? About educational work? The man had just ended his marriage over my seating arrangement, and now he wanted to discuss professional opportunities? Did he say what kind of proposition? I asked. No, but he seemed very sincere about wanting to talk with you. He left his direct number and asked me to pass along his request for a meeting. Dr. Martinez handed me a slip of paper with a phone number written in her careful handwriting. Cassandra, she said, leaning forward slightly, I don't know what happened at this wedding, and it's not really my business. But whatever it was, it seems to have revealed something about your character that people respect. Don't let embarrassment prevent you from exploring opportunities that might benefit both you and our students. I spent the rest of the school day trying to focus on teaching, while my mind raced with questions about what Marcus might want to discuss. My students seemed to sense my distraction, though they had no context for understanding it. During lunch, I finally worked up the courage to call the number Dr. Martinez had given me. Marcus answered on the second ring. Cassandra, he said, his voice warm but tired. Thank you for calling. I was hoping we could meet somewhere private to talk. There are things I'd like to discuss with you, and I think you deserve some explanations about what happened Saturday night. We arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop in the Alberta district, far from the upscale establishments where we might encounter anyone from Evelyn's social circle. I arrived early and chose a corner table where we could talk without being overheard, though I wasn't sure what we had to discuss that required such privacy. Marcus arrived exactly on time, looking different than he had at the wedding. Gone was the formal tuxedo and carefully styled hair, replaced by jeans and a simple button-down shirt that made him seem more approachable, more human. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Thank you for meeting me, he said, sitting across from me and wrapping his hands around the coffee cup he'd ordered. I know this is probably awkward, given everything that happened. It's definitely awkward, I agreed. How are you doing? He was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he was still figuring out how to ask. I'm processing, he said finally. I keep replaying Saturday night, wondering if I overreacted, if there was a better way to handle the situation. But then I remember how you looked when you realized where you'd been seated, and I know I did the right thing. Marcus, I said carefully, you ended your marriage over a seating chart. Are you sure you're not having second thoughts? It wasn't about the seating chart, he said, looking up at me with clear, serious eyes. It was about what the seating chart represented. It was about discovering that the woman I was marrying had values that were fundamentally incompatible with mine. He leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more thoughtful. My family has money, obviously. I grew up with privilege, went to expensive schools, had opportunities that most people don't get. But my parents also taught me that privilege comes with responsibility, that having advantages means you have an obligation to use them to help others. I listened, curious about where this conversation was heading. When I met Evelyn, I thought I'd found someone who shared those values, he continued. She was smart, ambitious, passionate about social causes. But somewhere in the process of planning this wedding, I started to see a different side of her. The way she talked about people, the way she made decisions about who was important and who wasn't, the way she seemed to prioritize image over substance. He took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. Saturday night wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of months of small moments that made me uncomfortable, but that I kept rationalizing away. The way she talked about your job, like teaching was something you did because you couldn't do anything better. The way she excluded you from wedding planning decisions, like your opinions didn't matter because you couldn't afford to implement them anyway. The way she seemed embarrassed by you instead of proud of you. I felt a pang of sadness hearing this confirmation of what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. I should have spoken up sooner, Marcus continued. I should have said something when she made those comments about your apartment being too small for the bridesmaids to get ready in, or when she suggested you might not fit in at certain pre-wedding events. I kept telling myself she was just stressed about the wedding, that she didn't mean to be hurtful. But she did mean it, I said quietly. Yes, he said. She did. And Saturday night made that impossible to ignore. We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the weight of what had been revealed and lost. So what happens now? I asked. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. I've been thinking about the conversation we had at the rehearsal dinner, when you mentioned some of the challenges you face as a teacher. The lack of resources, the difficulty of reaching students who don't see education as relevant to their lives, the way budget cuts have eliminated programs that could make a real difference. I remembered that conversation. It had been one of the few genuine interactions I'd had during the entire wedding process, a moment when Marcus had seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my work, rather than making polite small talk. My family's foundation has been looking for new educational initiatives to support, he continued. We've funded scholarships and building projects, but we want to do something more direct, more connected to actual classroom teaching and learning. He pulled out a folder from the messenger bag he'd brought with him. I'd like to propose a partnership. You would develop and lead educational programs that address the gaps you've identified in traditional public education. Programs that connect learning to real-world applications, that provide resources teachers need but can't afford, that create opportunities for students who might not otherwise see college or career training as possibilities. I stared at the folder, not sure I understood what he was offering. The foundation would provide funding for these programs, he continued, but you would design and implement them. You'd have the freedom to create curriculum, hire additional teachers, develop partnerships with local businesses and organizations, whatever you think would be most effective. This was not what I'd expected from our coffee meeting. I'd anticipated an awkward conversation about family dynamics and maybe an apology for the chaos he'd created at the wedding. Instead, he was offering me the kind of professional opportunity I'd only dreamed about. Marcus, this sounds incredible, but I have to ask why you're offering this to me specifically. You barely know me. I know enough, he said. I know that you've dedicated your career to teaching despite the financial limitations it imposes. I know that you care more about your students' success than about social status or personal advancement. I know that you have integrity under pressure and that you value authenticity over appearances. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. Most importantly, I know that you understand what it means to be underestimated and overlooked. You know what it feels like to have people make assumptions about your worth based on external circumstances. That perspective is exactly what educational programs need if they're going to reach students who face similar challenges. The folder contained detailed information about the Foundation's resources, examples of previous educational initiatives they'd funded, and a preliminary budget for the kind of program Marcus was describing. The numbers were staggering, representing more money than my school's entire annual budget. This would be a full-time position, he said. You'd be leaving teaching to focus entirely on program development and implementation. The salary would be competitive with administrative positions in higher education, and you'd have access to resources that could help hundreds of students rather than just the 30 or 40 you reach in a classroom each year. I flipped through the papers, trying to process the scope of what he was proposing. It was everything I'd ever wanted as an educator, the chance to address systemic problems rather than just managing their symptoms. But it was also overwhelming and complicated by the circumstances under which it was being offered. Marcus, I said, looking up from the folder, I'm honored by this offer, but I have to wonder if you're making it because you feel guilty about what happened with Evelyn. I don't want a job offer that's really an apology in disguise. His expression became serious, almost stern. Cassandra, I'm a businessman. I don't make $250,000 investments based on guilt or sentiment. I'm offering you this position because I think you're the right person for the job, and because I think this program could make a real difference in students' lives." He paused, then continued more gently. "What happened at the wedding revealed something about your character that impressed me, yes. But it also revealed something about educational inequality that I'd been thinking about abstractly. Seeing how you were treated because of your profession, because of your income level, because of your different priorities, made me realize how many students must feel the same way every day." I closed the folder, needing a moment to think clearly about what he was offering and what accepting it would mean. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. What happened with Evelyn after I left on Saturday?" Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "She tried to convince me that I was overreacting, that the seating arrangement really had been a mistake. When that didn't work, she accused me of humiliating her publicly and destroying her special day. When that didn't work, she suggested that maybe we could work things out if I was willing to overlook this one incident. And what did you tell her? That there's no working things out with someone whose fundamental values are incompatible with yours. That I couldn't build a life with someone who could treat family the way she treated you. That I was grateful to have learned who she really was before we were legally bound together." He took a deep breath before continuing. "Her parents are threatening to sue me for the cost of the wedding. Her friends are spreading stories about how I'm emotionally unstable and prone to dramatic outbursts. The social circle she'd introduced me to has essentially ostracized me for embarrassing one of their own." "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure sorry was the right word for what I felt. "Don't be," he replied. "It's clarifying. I'm discovering who my real friends are, and I'm learning about communities I want to be part of versus communities I want to avoid. It's painful, but it's also liberating." "What about your family? How are they handling all this?" "My parents are proud of me," he said, smiling for the first time since he'd arrived. "They've been worried about some of the changes they saw in me after I started dating Evelyn, and they're relieved that I chose integrity over social convenience." My sister said it was the most romantic thing she'd ever seen, standing up for someone's dignity like that. "Romantic?" I repeated, confused. "Not romantic toward you," he clarified quickly. "Romantic in the sense of being idealistic, principled, willing to sacrifice practical considerations for moral ones." She said it reminded her of heroes in the novels she reads. We talked for another hour about the educational program he was proposing, about the logistics of transitioning from teaching to program development, about the timeline for implementation, and the metrics for measuring success. The more we discussed it, the more excited I became about the possibilities. But I also felt a nagging concern about the appearance of accepting such a significant opportunity from someone who just dramatically ended his engagement to my sister. "Marcus," I said as we prepared to leave, "I'm genuinely interested in this position, but I need to think about the optics. People are going to say you offered me this job because of what happened at the wedding, that you're trying to make up for the drama you caused." "Let them say that," he replied. "People who would reduce your qualifications and potential impact to gossip about personal relationships aren't people whose opinions should influence your career decisions." He stood up and extended his hand for a business-like handshake. "Take the weekend to think about it. Read through all the materials, do your own research on educational foundation work, maybe talk to some people in the field about what this kind of position involves. If you decide you're interested, we can set up meetings with the foundation board and start the formal interview process." I shook his hand, feeling the weight of a decision that could change everything about my professional life. "Thank you," I said, "for the opportunity and for what you did Saturday night. I know it cost you a lot. It cost me a marriage that was built on false assumptions," he said. "That's not really a loss." After Marcus left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, reading through the materials he'd provided and trying to imagine what my life might look like if I accepted his offer. Instead of grading papers every evening, I'd be developing curriculum that could reach hundreds of students. Instead of scraping together resources for my classroom, I'd have access to funding that could transform entire programs. Instead of feeling like I was constantly fighting against systemic limitations, I'd have the power to address those limitations directly. but I'd also be leaving behind the direct student contact that had drawn me to teaching in the first place. I'd be moving into the world of administration and foundation work, dealing with budgets and board meetings instead of lesson plans and classroom discussions. I'd be working for the family of the man who just publicly ended his engagement to my sister, creating a level of personal and professional complexity that felt daunting. That evening, I finally worked up the courage to check the messages that had been accumulating on my phone since Saturday night. Most were from colleagues and friends who'd heard various versions of the wedding story and wanted to check on me. A few were from reporters who'd somehow gotten my number and wanted quotes about the incident. Several were from my parents, who'd heard about what happened and were worried about how I was handling everything. But the message that surprised me most was from my college roommate, Diana, who now worked as a program coordinator for a nonprofit in Seattle. Cass, her voicemail said, "I just heard about what happened at your sister's wedding, and I wanted you to know that everyone I've talked to thinks you're amazing for how you handled yourself. But I also wanted to tell you about something that might interest you professionally. We're looking for someone to head up our new educational outreach program, and after hearing about how you dealt with that impossible situation, I think you'd be perfect for it. Call me when you get a chance." 2 job offers in one day. Either I was suddenly much more marketable than I'd realized, or the wedding incident had created opportunities I never could have anticipated. I spent the rest of the week researching both positions, talking to people in educational nonprofits, and trying to understand what accepting either offer would mean for my career and my life. The more I learned, the more excited I became about the possibility of moving beyond classroom teaching into program development and educational policy work. But I also spent time thinking about my relationship with Evelyn and what accepting Marcus's offer might mean for any chance of reconciling with my sister. On Thursday evening, she finally called me. "Cass," she said when I answered, her voice sounding small and defeated. "We need to talk." I'd been dreading this conversation all week, but I'd also known it was inevitable. "All right," I said. "Do you want to meet somewhere? Or talk on the phone? Can you come over?" she asked. "I'm staying at Mom and Dad's for a few days, just until I figure out what I'm going to do next." Our parents' house felt like neutral territory, a place where we'd learned to be sisters before we'd learned to be anything else. I drove over that evening, unsure what to expect but hoping we could find some way to begin repairing the damage that had been done. I found Evelyn in our childhood bedroom, sitting on the twin bed that had been hers throughout high school, still decorated with the posters and photographs she'd left behind when she moved to San Francisco. She looked younger somehow, diminished without the designer clothes and professional makeup that had become her armor in recent years. "Hi," I said, sitting down on my own childhood bed across from her. "Hi," she replied, not quite meeting my eyes. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us probably remembering easier times when our biggest conflicts had been about borrowing clothes or monopolizing the bathroom. "I owe you an apology," Evelyn said finally. "For the seating arrangement. For the way I treated you during the wedding planning. For prioritizing other people's opinions over our relationship." I waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. "I've been thinking about what Marcus said. About my values and priorities," she continued. "About the kind of person I've become over the past year. And I'm scared that he was right about me." Her voice began to shake, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "I don't know when I started thinking that your job wasn't important, that your life wasn't as valuable as the lives of people with more money. I don't know when I started feeling ashamed of where we came from instead of proud of what we'd accomplished." She looked around the bedroom we'd shared, taking in the evidence of our middle-class upbringing. "Mom and Dad worked so hard to give us opportunities," she said. "They saved for years to help us with college. They supported our dreams, even when those dreams were expensive or impractical. And somewhere along the way, I started seeing their sacrifices as limitations instead of gifts." I felt my own eyes beginning to water, hearing her acknowledge truths I'd been hoping she'd recognize. "Evelyn," I said gently, "what happened to you? You used to be the person who stood up for the underdog, who got angry when people were treated unfairly. When did you start caring more about impressing people than about being true to yourself?" She was quiet for a long time, considering the question seriously. "I think it started when I moved to San Francisco," she said finally. "Everyone in my MBA program came from money, from families with connections and influence. I felt like I had to work twice as hard to prove I belonged there, and part of that meant learning to talk like them, to value what they valued, to see the world through their eyes. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And then when I met Marcus, I wanted so badly to fit into his world that I started rejecting everything about my own world. Including you. Including our family. Including the values that actually made me who I was. We talked for another 2 hours, revisiting years of growing distance and misunderstanding, acknowledging hurt feelings and missed opportunities for connection. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a recognition that we'd both contributed to the breakdown of our relationship, and that we both wanted to find a way back to being sisters. Evelyn, I said as we prepared to end the conversation, I need to tell you about something. Marcus offered me a job with his family's foundation, developing educational programs. It's an incredible opportunity, but I wanted you to know about it before I made any decisions. Her expression shifted, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old resentment, the automatic assumption that I was somehow benefiting from her misfortune. But then she took a deep breath, and seemed to consciously choose a different response. "That's wonderful, Cass," she said, and her voice sounded genuine. "You'd be amazing at that kind of work. You care about education and helping students in ways that would make those programs really meaningful. You're not upset?" I asked. "About me potentially working with Marcus after everything that happened?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm hurt," she said honestly, "and I'm probably going to be jealous when I see you succeeding in work that matters to you. But I'm also proud of you, and I want you to have opportunities that match your talents and dedication." She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. "Don't turn down a job that could change your life because you're worried about my feelings. I've made enough mistakes lately without adding the guilt of limiting your opportunities to the list." That weekend, I made my decision. I called Marcus on Sunday evening and accepted his offer, then called Diana in Seattle and thanked her for thinking of me, but explained that I'd decided to pursue a different opportunity. Monday morning, I walked into Dr. Martinez's office and submitted my resignation, effective at the end of the school year. It was one of the hardest conversations of my professional life, leaving a job I loved and students I cared about to pursue an opportunity that felt both exciting and terrifying. The next few weeks passed in a blur of transition planning, final exams, and preparation for my new role. The Foundation's board approved my hiring after a series of interviews that felt more like collaborative planning sessions than evaluations. I spent hours with Marcus and the other board members, developing program goals, identifying partner schools, and creating timelines for implementation. The work was intellectually stimulating in ways that classroom teaching hadn't been. Instead of adapting to limitations, I was working to eliminate them. Instead of managing resources that were already allocated, I was determining how resources should be distributed. Instead of helping individual students navigate a flawed system, I was working to improve the system itself. But the transition also brought unexpected challenges. Colleagues at Roosevelt Academy were supportive, but puzzled by my career change, especially given the dramatic circumstances that had preceded it. Some suspected that my new position was connected to the wedding incident, and I found myself constantly defending my qualifications and explaining that my hiring had been based on merit rather than sympathy. The social complications were even more complex. Portland's educational community was small enough that word of my new role spread quickly, and with it came speculation about my relationship with Marcus and the circumstances of Evelyn's broken engagement. At professional gatherings, I noticed conversations that stopped when I approached, and I realized that I'd become the subject of gossip in circles where I'd previously been anonymous. Most challenging was learning to navigate my new professional relationship with Marcus. He was intelligent, dedicated, and genuinely committed to educational equity, but he was also my sister's former fiancé and the person whose dramatic gesture had inadvertently created my current opportunity. We worked well together, sharing similar values and complementary skills, but we were both conscious of the need to maintain appropriate boundaries and professional distance. The first program we developed together focused on creating mentorship opportunities for students from low-income families, connecting them with professionals who could provide guidance about college applications, career planning, and financial literacy. It was exactly the kind of intervention I'd wished I could provide for my students but had never had the resources to implement. Watching the program take shape, seeing students gain confidence and expand their sense of possibility, I felt a satisfaction that was different from, but just as meaningful as the rewards of classroom teaching. I was still helping students learn and grow, but I was doing it systematically, addressing root causes rather than just managing symptoms. 3 months into my new position, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything I'd learned about forgiveness, family, and the complexity of human relationships. It was from Patricia Rothschild, Marcus's mother, asking if I'd be willing to meet with her for lunch. I'd only met Patricia a few times during Evelyn's engagement, brief encounters at dinner parties and social events where she'd been polite but distant. I knew she'd supported Marcus's decision to end the engagement, but I had no idea what she might want to discuss with me now. We met at a quiet restaurant in the Pearl District, and Patricia arrived looking every inch the society matron she was, impeccably dressed and carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her opinions matter. But her expression was warmer than I'd expected, and she greeted me with what seemed like genuine friendliness. "Cassandra," she said after we'd ordered lunch, "thank you for meeting with me. I wanted to talk with you about Marcus, and about the work you're doing with the foundation." I waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I've been watching how you've handled this transition," she continued, "both professionally and personally. The grace you've shown in a difficult situation, the dedication you've brought to your new role, the way you've managed to maintain your dignity despite considerable gossip and speculation." "Thank you," I said, though I wondered if there was a point beyond the compliments. "I also want you to know that I'm aware of the sacrifices you've made," she said, her tone becoming more serious. "Leaving a career you loved, accepting a position that came with complicated personal circumstances. Working with my son when doing so created additional scrutiny and speculation about your motivations." Patricia paused to take a sip of her water, gathering her thoughts. "What I'm trying to say is that I recognize the courage it took to accept this opportunity, and I want you to know that the entire board appreciates not just your professional contributions, but your character and integrity." I felt myself blushing, uncomfortable with such direct praise, but also moved by her acknowledgement of the challenges I'd faced. "There's something else," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I think you should know that Marcus has feelings for you." The words hit me like a physical shock, and I felt my face flush with surprise and confusion. "Mrs. Rothschild," I said, "I think there might be some misunderstanding. Marcus and I have a professional relationship, nothing more. We've been very careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. I'm sure you have," she said calmly. "And I'm not suggesting that either of you has acted inappropriately. But I've known my son for 35 years, and I can see how he looks at you, how he talks about you, how he lights up when he discusses your work together." I stared at her, trying to process this information and its implications. "I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know," she continued. "But also because I want you to understand that if you're not interested in Marcus romantically, you need to be very clear about that. He's been through enough emotional upheaval recently, and he doesn't need the added confusion of wondering about feelings that might not be reciprocated." "Mrs. Rothschild," I said carefully, "even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not sure it is, pursuing any kind of personal relationship with Marcus would be incredibly complicated. He was engaged to my sister 4 months ago. I work for his family's foundation. The professional and personal boundaries are too important to risk," she nodded thoughtfully. "Those are all valid concerns," she said. "But they're also all external considerations. What I'm asking is how you feel about Marcus as a person, separate from all the complicated circumstances." I sat there, forced to confront a question I'd been avoiding even in my own thoughts. How did I feel about Marcus? I respected him professionally, appreciated his intelligence and dedication, enjoyed our collaborative work relationship. But was there something more? Thinking about it honestly, I realized there had been moments, brief flashes of connection that felt like more than professional cooperation. Conversations that extended beyond work topics, shared laughter over inside jokes, moments of eye contact that lasted slightly longer than necessary. But I'd attributed all of those to the intensity of working closely together on projects we both cared about. "I care about Marcus as a colleague and a friend," I said finally. "But I've been very focused on maintaining professional boundaries, so I haven't really allowed myself to consider whether there might be other feelings involved." Patricia smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her. "That's an honest answer," she said. "And it's exactly what I'd expect from someone with your integrity." but I hope you'll think about what I've said, and about what you might want if all the complications didn't exist. Our conversation continued for another hour, covering topics from foundation governance to family dynamics, to the challenges of building meaningful programs in bureaucratic environments. Patricia was intelligent and thoughtful, with insights about philanthropy and social change that helped me understand the broader context of the work I was doing. As we prepared to leave, she made one final comment that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "Cassandra," she said, placing her hand briefly on my arm, "don't let other people's mistakes or expectations prevent you from pursuing happiness. You've already proven that you have the courage to make difficult choices for the right reasons. Trust yourself to know what those reasons are." That evening, I sat in my apartment, looking through the foundation materials I'd brought home and thinking about Patricia's words. For months, I'd been so focused on navigating the professional challenges of my new role that I hadn't allowed myself to consider the personal dimensions of working so closely with Marcus. But now, forced to examine my feelings honestly, I realized that Patricia might be right. There was something between Marcus and me, something that went beyond professional collaboration or shared commitment to educational equity. The question was whether acknowledging those feelings would help or complicate an already complex situation. I was still wrestling with these thoughts when my phone rang. It was Marcus, calling about a program detail we needed to resolve before the next board meeting. "Cassandra," he said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm it always held when he discussed our work, "I've been thinking about the mentorship program expansion, and I have some ideas about partnerships with local businesses that might provide internship opportunities for students." We talked for 45 minutes about program logistics, funding allocation, and implementation timelines. But throughout the conversation, I found myself listening not just to what he was saying, but to how he was saying it. Paying attention to the warmth in his voice, the way he built on my ideas, the easy rhythm of our professional partnership. When we finished discussing work matters, there was a moment of silence that felt different from our usual efficient endings to business calls. "Cassandra," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more personal, "I wanted to ask you something. Would you be interested in having dinner this weekend? Not for work, not to discuss foundation business, just to spend time together as friends." The question hung in the air, loaded with implications we both understood but hadn't explicitly acknowledged. "Marcus," I said carefully, "I'd like that. But I think we need to talk about what having dinner as friends means, given everything that's happened, and our working relationship." "I know," he said. "There are a lot of factors to consider, a lot of potential complications. But I also think there's something between us that's worth exploring, if you're comfortable with that." I took a deep breath, thinking about Patricia's advice about trusting myself to make difficult choices for the right reasons. "Yes," I said, "I'd like to have dinner with you. And I think we do need to talk about what's happening between us." We arranged to meet Saturday evening at a restaurant in the Alberta district, the same neighborhood where we'd had our first coffee meeting months earlier. It felt appropriate, somehow, to return to the place where our professional relationship had begun to explore whether there might be something more personal worth pursuing. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I was about to cross a line I'd been carefully maintaining since I'd started working for the foundation. I was about to find out whether the connection I felt with Marcus was real, and whether it was strong enough to navigate the complicated history and social expectations that surrounded us both. But for the first time since the wedding that had changed everything, I felt ready to find out what might be possible when I stopped letting other people's mistakes define the boundaries of my own choices. Saturday evening arrived with unexpected rain, the kind of gentle Portland drizzle that turns the city soft and intimate. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, changing clothes for the third time, trying to find the right balance between casual and thoughtful for what was ostensibly a friendly dinner but felt like something much more significant. I finally settled on a deep green dress that I'd bought for a faculty dinner the previous year, paired with the vintage leather boots I'd found at a consignment shop in Hawthorne. It was authentically me, neither trying too hard nor dismissing the importance of the evening, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who belonged in her own life rather than trying to fit into someone else's expectations. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was perfect. a small place called Harvest that specialized in locally sourced ingredients and had the kind of warm, unpretentious atmosphere that made conversation feel natural. I arrived a few minutes early and was seated at a corner table with soft lighting and enough privacy for whatever kind of conversation we were about to have. Marcus appeared exactly on time, and I felt my breath catch slightly when I saw him. He looked different outside of our professional meetings. More relaxed, but also more intentionally put together, wearing dark jeans and a navy sweater that brought out his eyes. When he smiled and walked toward the table, I realized that Patricia had been right about something shifting in how I saw him. "You look beautiful," he said as he sat down, the compliment offered simply and sincerely without the calculated charm I'd learned to expect from men who moved in wealthy social circles. "Thank you," I replied, feeling myself blush slightly. "You look pretty good yourself." The first few minutes of conversation felt careful, both of us navigating the transition from professional colleagues to something more personal. We discussed the restaurant, the weather, mutual observations about Portland's neighborhoods, testing the waters of how we communicated when foundation business wasn't providing the structure for our interaction. But as we ordered dinner and settled into the evening, the conversation began to flow more naturally. Marcus asked about my teaching background, really asked, wanting to know what had drawn me to education and what I'd found most rewarding about classroom work. I found myself talking about specific students who'd overcome challenges, about the moments when struggling readers suddenly connected with a book, about the satisfaction of watching teenagers discover they were smarter than they'd believed themselves to be. "I've never heard you talk about teaching quite like that," Marcus said after I'd finished describing a particularly difficult student who'd eventually gone on to college. "In our professional meetings, you focus on systemic issues and program development. But hearing you talk about individual students, I can see why you were drawn to the classroom in the first place. It's different, being responsible for specific kids every day versus designing programs that will hopefully help kids I may never meet," I said. "Both matter, but there's something immediate and personal about teaching that I miss sometimes." "Do you regret leaving the classroom?" he asked. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the students I'd left behind and the daily interactions that had given structure and meaning to my previous life. "Not regret, exactly," I said. "But I do miss certain aspects of it. There's something to be said for knowing at the end of each day that you've directly influenced real people's lives, even in small ways." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, and I could see him processing this information in the context of the foundation work we were doing together. "Is there a way to incorporate more direct student contact into your current role?" he asked. "Maybe through pilot programs or on-site implementation of initiatives we're funding." The question revealed something about Marcus that I'd been noticing more frequently in our professional interactions. He listened not just to respond or to manage, but to understand and to find ways to address underlying concerns. It was a quality that would have made him a good teacher himself, and it was part of what made our working relationship so productive. "Maybe," I said. "I'd have to think about how to structure that without undermining the program directors at partner schools." We continued talking about education, about the challenges of creating meaningful change within bureaucratic systems, about the balance between idealism and pragmatism in reform efforts. It was the kind of conversation I'd rarely had outside of graduate school, the kind of intellectual exchange that left me feeling energized and understood. But gradually, the conversation began to shift toward more personal territory. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as we waited for dessert. "What was it like, growing up with Evelyn, before she became the person I met, before the social climbing and the image management?" I smiled, thinking about my sister as she had been in childhood and adolescence. "She was magical," I said, "truly magnetic in ways that weren't calculated or performative. She could walk into any room, and within 5 minutes, everyone would be gravitating toward her, wanting to be part of whatever she was doing." I paused, remembering specific moments from our shared childhood. She was also fiercely loyal, especially to people she thought were being treated unfairly. In high school, she befriended this girl, Amy, who was being bullied for being overweight and shy. Evelyn didn't just include her in our social group, she actively defended her and made sure other people treated her with respect. "What changed?" Marcus asked gently. I think she started believing that being magnetic and socially successful was the same thing as being valuable, I said. Somewhere along the way, she began to see social status as a measure of worth, rather than just one aspect of a complex life. I looked down at my hands, thinking about the sister I'd lost long before the wedding incident. The worst part is that she was already valuable, already impressive, without any of the status seeking. She was smart and funny and capable of genuine kindness. But she started to see those qualities as insufficient if they didn't come with the right clothes, the right connections, the right social circle. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and I could see him thinking about his own relationship with Evelyn and the signals he might have missed or chosen to ignore. "I think I enabled some of that transformation," he said finally. "Not intentionally, but by introducing her to social circles where image mattered more than substance, where people were valued for their connections rather than their character." "You didn't make her choices for her," I said. "But I think being with you gave her access to a world she'd always been curious about. And once she got there, she decided she wanted to belong more than she wanted to stay true to herself." "Do you think she can find her way back?" he asked. "I hope so," I replied. Our conversation last week was the first time in months that she sounded like the sister I grew up with. But I think it's going to take time for her to figure out who she wants to be when she's not trying to impress anyone. The dessert arrived, a shared chocolate tart that was rich enough to require small bites and plenty of conversation in between. The intimacy of sharing food, of the easy back and forth of forks and laughter, felt like a natural progression from the emotional honesty we'd been building throughout the evening. "Can I ask you something now?" I said as we finished the last of the tart. "Of course. What was it like for you that night at the wedding? Making the decision to end things so publicly, so dramatically?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression becoming more serious as he considered how to answer. "Terrifying," he said finally. "And liberating, and devastating, and right, all at the same time. I'd been having doubts for weeks, maybe months, but I kept telling myself they were just pre-wedding nerves, that every couple goes through periods of uncertainty." He took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. "But seeing you at that table, seeing the look on your face when you realized where you'd been seated, it was like a moment of absolute clarity. I realized that I was about to legally bind myself to someone whose values were fundamentally incompatible with mine, and that if I didn't act immediately, I might not have the courage to act at all." "Were you afraid you'd made a mistake? After, when you had time to think about it?" "Every day for the first month," he admitted. "Not about ending the engagement, but about the way I did it. Whether there might have been a less public, less humiliating way to address the situation." "What convinced you that you'd done the right thing?" "Talking to my family, mostly. My parents and my sister all said they'd been worried about changes they'd seen in me since I'd been with Evelyn, changes I hadn't even recognized in myself. They said that standing up for you, for basic human decency, was the most like myself they'd seen me in a year." He looked directly at me, his expression becoming more intense. "But also talking to you. Working with you, seeing your integrity and your commitment to values that actually matter. It made me realize what I'd been compromising in myself by accepting Evelyn's priorities as normal or necessary." The conversation was becoming more intimate than either of us had probably intended, moving into territory that felt both exciting and dangerous given our professional relationship and the complicated history that had brought us together. "Marcus," I said, "before this goes any further, I think we need to acknowledge the elephant in the room." "Which elephant?" he asked with a slight smile. "There seem to be several." "All of them," I said, laughing despite the seriousness of what we were discussing. "The fact that you were engaged to my sister 4 months ago. The fact that I work for your family's foundation. The fact that half of Portland's social scene thinks you offered me the job because you felt guilty about the wedding drama." Marcus nodded seriously. "Those are all real complications," he said, "and if you think they're insurmountable, I'll respect that completely. Our working relationship is too important to risk over personal feelings that might not lead anywhere productive. But if you're willing to navigate the complications," he continued, "I think what's developing between us might be worth the effort." I felt my heart rate increase as we moved from acknowledging attraction to discussing the possibility of acting on it. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. I'm suggesting that we're both adults who are capable of making thoughtful decisions about complex situations, Marcus said. I'm suggesting that we continue to maintain professional boundaries at work, while exploring whether there's potential for something personal outside of our foundation responsibilities. He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more earnest. I'm also suggesting that we be completely honest with each other about concerns, expectations, and boundaries, because neither of us can afford to have this go badly. The practical part of my mind immediately began cataloging all the ways pursuing a relationship with Marcus could complicate my life. The gossip it would generate, the questions it would raise about my professional motivations, the potential impact on my relationship with Evelyn, the power dynamics inherent in dating someone whose family employed me. But there was another part of my mind, one that had been growing stronger since the wedding incident, that was tired of making decisions based on other people's potential reactions. The part that had walked away from the staff table with my dignity intact, that had chosen to accept a challenging professional opportunity despite social complications, that had learned to value authenticity over convenience. I think you're right that it's worth exploring, I said carefully. But I also think we need to establish some clear parameters about how we handle the professional and personal aspects of this. Agreed, Marcus said. What kind of parameters are you thinking about? Complete transparency with the foundation board about our personal relationship, I said, thinking through the implications as I spoke. No special treatment or favoritism in professional settings. Separate social circles when possible, so we're not constantly navigating the wedding aftermath in our personal time together. Those all sound reasonable, Marcus said. What about Evelyn? Do you want to tell her what's happening between us? I considered this question, thinking about my recent conversation with my sister and the fragile reconciliation we were building. Eventually, yes, I said. But maybe not immediately. I'd like her to have some time to process her own situation before adding this complexity to the mix. That makes sense, Marcus agreed. What about the timeline? Do you want to take this slowly, or do you feel like we've already been building toward this for months? I thought about the question seriously, considering how long I'd been aware of my attraction to Marcus, and how the foundation work had created an intimacy that felt like the early stages of a relationship already. I think we have been building toward this, I said. But I also think we should be intentional about the next steps rather than just letting momentum carry us forward. Marcus smiled, the kind of genuine expression that made me remember why I'd been drawn to him in the first place. So what would intentional next steps look like, he asked. More dinners like this one, I suggested. Spending time together outside of work contexts, getting to know each other as people rather than just as professional collaborators. Figuring out whether we're compatible in ways that go beyond shared values about education and social justice. That sounds perfect, Marcus said. And it sounds like a plan that respects both the potential and the complications of this situation. We spent another hour at the restaurant, talking about lighter topics but maintaining the new level of intimacy we'd established. When Marcus walked me to my car, there was a moment of awkwardness as we both wondered how to end the evening appropriately. He solved the dilemma by taking my hand gently and asking if he could kiss me goodnight. The kiss was soft and brief, more of a question than a statement. And when we pulled apart, I felt like we'd crossed a line that had been waiting to be crossed for months. I had a wonderful time tonight, I said. So did I, Marcus replied. Would you like to do this again next weekend? Yes, I said, feeling more certain than I had about anything in months. I would like that very much. The following weeks fell into a pattern that felt both natural and carefully constructed. Marcus and I maintained complete professionalism during foundation meetings and business calls, but we began spending evenings and weekends together, exploring Portland's neighborhoods, trying new restaurants, attending cultural events that neither of us had made time for when we were focused solely on work. What surprised me most about dating Marcus was how different he was from the wealthy heir I'd expected him to be. He was curious about parts of the city he'd never explored, enthusiastic about food trucks and dive bars, genuinely interested in the books I recommended and the music I listened to. He seemed to appreciate having someone in his life who valued experiences over status symbols, who chose activities based on interest rather than social implications. More importantly, He was thoughtful about the ways his privilege affected our relationship. When he suggested expensive restaurants or events, he was conscious about offering to pay without making me feel like a charity case. When we attended social gatherings, he was protective of my comfort level, without being condescending about my background. The foundation work continued to go well, with our personal relationship actually enhancing our professional collaboration rather than complicating it. We understood each other's communication styles better, trusted each other's judgment more completely, and shared a sense of purpose that made even difficult projects feel manageable. But the social complications were real and ongoing. Portland's professional circles were small enough that our relationship became a subject of speculation and gossip relatively quickly. I heard whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, received invitations to social events that felt more like opportunities for people to observe our dynamic than genuine hospitality. The most challenging aspect was dealing with people who assumed that our relationship invalidated my professional qualifications, or suggested that Marcus had hired me for personal rather than merit-based reasons. I found myself constantly having to prove my competence in ways that my male colleagues never faced, demonstrating that my ideas and achievements were independent of my romantic relationship. Marcus was supportive during these challenges, making clear in professional settings that my contributions were valued on their own merits. But he couldn't shield me completely from the assumptions and judgments of people who found our relationship scandalous or suspicious. The situation with Evelyn remained delicate. She and I had continued to rebuild our relationship through regular phone calls and occasional dinners, but I hadn't yet told her about my personal involvement with Marcus. I kept telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, but I also knew I was avoiding a conversation that would test the fragile progress we'd made. The moment of truth came unexpectedly, during what was supposed to be a casual family dinner at our parents' house. Evelyn had been staying there on and off since the wedding incident, using our childhood home as a base while she figured out her next steps professionally and personally. I arrived at the house to find Evelyn, my parents, and Marcus all sitting in the living room, engaged in what appeared to be a pleasant conversation about foundation work and educational policy. Marcus looked up when I entered, his face showing a mixture of surprise and concern that probably matched my own expression. "Surprise, Cass," my mother said, beaming with the kind of maternal pride that suggested she thought she'd orchestrated something wonderful. "Marcus stopped by to discuss some foundation business with you, and when he found out we were having a family dinner, I invited him to stay." I looked at Marcus, trying to read whether this had been planned or was as unexpected for him as it was for me. His slight shrug and apologetic expression suggested the latter. "I hope that's all right," Marcus said, standing up as I entered the room. "Your mother was very insistent, and it seemed rude to refuse." "Of course it's all right," my father said before I could respond. "We don't often get to meet the people Cassandra works with, and it's interesting to hear about the Foundation's programs from a different perspective." Evelyn had been quiet during this exchange, but I could see her watching Marcus and me carefully, noting the way we looked at each other, the subtle body language that suggested familiarity beyond professional collaboration. Dinner was an exercise in careful navigation, with all of us conscious of the undercurrents but trying to maintain normal conversation. My parents asked Marcus about his background and interests, clearly impressed by his knowledge of educational issues and his thoughtful responses to their questions. Marcus was charming and respectful, asking about their work and showing genuine interest in their perspectives on local politics and community issues. But I could feel Evelyn's attention throughout the meal, her sharp intelligence focused on decoding the dynamic between Marcus and me. When he passed me the salt without being asked, when I laughed at his joke before he'd finished telling it, when our hands brushed as we both reached for the breadbasket, I knew she was cataloging evidence of intimacy that went beyond professional collaboration. After dinner, when my parents had moved to the kitchen to clean up and prepare coffee, Evelyn cornered me in the hallway. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long? What?" I replied, though I knew exactly what she was asking. "How long have you and Marcus been involved personally?" I took a deep breath, knowing that the conversation I'd been avoiding was finally unavoidable. "About 6 weeks," I said. "Since the dinner when you and I talked about rebuilding our relationship." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, processing this information and its implications. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, and I could hear hurt in her voice alongside the question. Because I wanted you to have time to process your own situation before adding this complication. I said, because I was afraid it would damage the progress we'd been making as sisters. And because you thought I'd try to sabotage it, Evelyn said, not accusingly but with clear understanding of my concerns. Maybe, I admitted. I wasn't sure how you'd react, and I didn't want to risk losing you again. Evelyn looked toward the living room, where we could hear Marcus and my father discussing the Portland Trailblazers' prospects for the upcoming season. Do you love him? She asked. The question caught me off guard with its directness and its implications. I think I'm falling in love with him, I said honestly. But it's complicated by everything that's happened, by our professional relationship, by the history between all of us. He's good for you, Evelyn said quietly. I can see it in how you carry yourself, how comfortable you seem with yourself when he's around. You're more confident, more settled than I've seen you in years. I looked at my sister, surprised by her response, and moved by her generosity and recognizing something positive in a situation that must have been painful for her. I'm happy for you, Cass, she continued. Really, you deserve someone who sees your value, who appreciates the person you are without trying to change you into someone else. Thank you, I said, feeling tears forming in my eyes. That means more to me than you know. Just promise me one thing, Evelyn said. What's that? Promise me that you'll be careful with your heart. Marcus is a good man, but he's also someone who's used to having options, used to making decisions based on what feels right in the moment. Make sure he's choosing you for the right reasons, not just because you represent something different from what he had with me. It was a fair warning, one that acknowledged both Marcus's positive qualities and the potential risks of getting involved with someone whose previous relationship had ended so dramatically. I promise, I said. And Evelyn, I need you to know that this isn't about competing with you or trying to take something that was yours. This is about two people who discovered they care about each other while working toward shared goals. I know, she said. And I'm genuinely happy that you found each other, even if the circumstances are complicated. We rejoined the family in the living room, where the conversation continued for another hour before Marcus excused himself to head home. As he prepared to leave, he approached Evelyn directly. Evelyn, he said, I want you to know that I understand this situation is awkward, and I appreciate your graciousness tonight. If my relationship with Cassandra makes family gatherings uncomfortable for you, I'm happy to excuse myself from future occasions. Evelyn looked at him thoughtfully before responding. Marcus, she said, you hurt me deeply when you ended our engagement the way you did, but you also showed me something about myself that I needed to see, even if I wasn't ready to see it at the time. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Cassandra is my sister, and she's one of the best people I know. If you care about her, if you're committed to building something real with her, then you're welcome in our family. But if this is just a rebound relationship or a way of processing your own guilt about the wedding, then you need to figure that out before you hurt someone I love. Marcus nodded seriously, clearly taking her words to heart. I understand, he said. And I can promise you that my feelings for Cassandra are genuine and separate from anything related to our previous relationship. I care about her because of who she is, not because of any history between you and me. Good, Evelyn said. Then we don't have a problem. After Marcus left, my parents expressed their approval of him and their happiness about my personal and professional success. My mother in particular seemed delighted by the idea that I'd found someone who appreciated my work and values, though she also cautioned me about the potential complications of workplace relationships. The following months brought continued growth in both my professional responsibilities and my relationship with Marcus. The Foundation's educational programs were showing measurable results, with increased graduation rates at partner schools and higher college enrollment among students who'd participated in our mentorship initiatives. More personally, Marcus and I had settled into a relationship that felt both passionate and stable, built on shared values and genuine affection rather than just physical attraction or social convenience. We'd navigated the social complications successfully, with most of the initial gossip and speculation fading as people became accustomed to seeing us together and recognized the authenticity of our connection. The real test came 8 months after our first dinner, when Marcus asked me to move in with him. It was a practical decision in many ways, since we were spending most of our free time together anyway, but it also represented a significant commitment that would make our relationship more public and permanent. I said yes, but with conditions that protected both my independence and our professional relationship. I kept my own apartment as an office space and retreat, maintained separate finances, and insisted that we continued to be scrupulous about professional boundaries during foundation work. The arrangement worked better than either of us had expected. Living together deepened our intimacy without creating the codependence I'd worried about, and having shared domestic space gave us opportunities to support each other through work challenges and personal growth. A year after the wedding that had changed everything, Evelyn and I met for lunch at a cafe in the Pearl District, continuing the regular sister dates we'd established as part of rebuilding our relationship. She looked healthier and happier than she had in months, having started a new career in nonprofit communications and begun dating a social worker named David, who shared her renewed interest in meaningful work over social status. "You know what's funny?" she said as we finished our salads and prepared to order dessert. "I think the best thing that ever happened to me was having my wedding fall apart so spectacularly." "That's a pretty dramatic way to look at it," I replied. "But it's true. If Marcus hadn't called me out publicly, I might have spent years trying to be someone I wasn't, building a life based on values that didn't actually matter to me. The public humiliation was awful, but it also forced me to figure out who I really wanted to be." She smiled, the kind of genuine expression I remembered from our childhood. "And it led to you finding happiness with someone who's perfect for you," she continued. "Someone who sees your strength instead of your limitations, who values your contributions instead of taking them for granted." "I'm glad you see it that way," I said. I was worried for a long time that my relationship with Marcus would always be complicated by guilt about how it started. "The guilt should be mine, not yours," Evelyn said firmly. "You didn't do anything wrong by accepting a job you were qualified for, or by falling in love with someone who appreciated your worth. I'm the one who created the situation by forgetting what really mattered." We talked for another hour about our respective relationships, our work, and our hopes for the future. It felt like the kind of conversation I'd thought we might never have again. The easy intimacy of sisters who genuinely liked and respected each other. As we prepared to leave, Evelyn made an observation that stayed with me long after we'd said goodbye. "You know what I think is really beautiful about your story with Marcus?" she said. "It started with someone standing up for basic human dignity and evolved into a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. That's the kind of love story that actually lasts." That evening, I shared Evelyn's comments with Marcus as we prepared dinner together in the kitchen of the home we now shared. He listened thoughtfully, then made his own observation about how our relationship had developed. "I think what makes this work is that we started as allies before we became lovers," he said. "We were already committed to the same goals, already trusted each other's judgment, already knew we could work through difficulties together." He put his arms around me, pulling me close as we stood in the warm light of our kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life we'd built together. "I love you, Cassandra," he said. "Not because you're different from Evelyn, not because you represent some kind of redemption for past mistakes, but because you're exactly who you are. Because you have integrity and passion, and the courage to stand up for what matters, even when it's difficult." "I love you too," I replied, feeling the truth of those words settle into place like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been working on for months. A year later, Marcus proposed during a quiet dinner at Harvest, the restaurant where we'd had our first official date. The proposal was simple and perfect, offered without drama or public spectacle, based on our shared commitment to building a life together rather than creating a moment for social media or family expectations. We married in a small ceremony at my parents' house, surrounded by family and close friends who supported our relationship and understood the journey we'd taken to reach this point. Evelyn served as my maid of honor, a role that felt like a healing completion of the story that had begun with such pain and misunderstanding. The wedding was everything Evelyn's grand affair had not been. Intimate, authentic, focused on the commitment we were making rather than the impression we were creating. Instead of assigned seating based on social hierarchy, we had a casual reception where people mingled naturally and conversations flowed based on genuine connection rather than networking opportunities. As Marcus and I danced to our first song as a married couple, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. It had started with humiliation and family conflict, with the painful discovery that someone I loved had prioritized social status over familial loyalty. But it had led to professional opportunities I never could have imagined, to a love that was based on shared values and mutual respect, to a family reconciliation that was stronger because it had been tested and rebuilt on more authentic foundations. Most importantly, it had taught me that dignity and self-worth aren't determined by where other people choose to seat you. They're determined by how you choose to respond when you discover where you stand, and whether you have the courage to insist on being valued for who you truly are. Standing in the arms of my husband, surrounded by people who loved and respected us both, I realized that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that you don't belong where you thought you wanted to be. Because only then can you find your way to where you actually belong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.